Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to what is the second of these important community engagement question and answer sessions for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project. So look, it's a delight to have you all here. For those who have returned from a session we held on Saturday, the 4th of July, welcome back. For those who are new to this format, we wish you a very hearty welcome, and we hope you do make best use of this couple of hours you have with experts from the project team to help answer as many questions as possible. Before we take any further steps, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, also the traditional owners along the route and from wherever you are dialing into us this evening. It's a clear acknowledgement that many of you may in fact be dialing in from your home, you may be dialing in from a workplace or even at your kitchen table. So we really we thank you for that. There's also a couple of acknowledgements as well. We've heard very clearly from the participants on Saturday the 4th that you'd like to hear more questions. So we're going to spend as much time today as getting through as many questions as possible. You also wanted to know who were the questions asked from, and so we'll be getting to that in a short moment. Before I do, I'd just like to share a couple of moments. Clearly, there's a sense of despair and or concern with COVID announcements that were made just this afternoon. And in his latest update, the Premier clearly announced that there are restrictions coming into place as of tomorrow night. Now, obviously, this has been just announced, and as was the case with the original restrictions, we'll be working through how we can best manage this from a project perspective. And it's evolving as we speak, but rest assured, please, that we'll be coming back to you with the next path to follow during this latest change. And this is something clearly we're working on right now. It's a work in progress, but we'll have something in terms of the next steps for the project and how to engage with the project in the coming session on Thursday. Well, with that in mind, I'd also like to acknowledge that we'd much love to be here in person with you. We'd love to be able to, shake your hand, talk about your site, talk about the projects, but clearly that's not the case and it won't be for a little while. So by way of introduction, my name is Chris Robinson. I'll be your independent moderator today, and I've been asked, as we did on Saturday, to provide a facilitator role to get through as many questions as we possibly can in the time we have. I've been assembled today in our office here in Carlton, which is in fact not AusNet's office, but an office where we've been able to socially distance and separate from each other. So we've got 4 people in this room, and that's in accordance with requirements. Now, some people said on Saturday that we're looking not at the camera, we're looking over the screen. That was because we're all in the same room. So we'll make sure that we're looking as best we can dead at the camera to you all here today. So we hope that that is a little bit less disconcerting for you. Finally, we're learning as we go in many respects with these engagements online. We hope that you'll be with us, and tonight we'll be also sharing the questions as they come through as best we can manage those. And we hope that's an improvement on the program we had with you on Saturday. Just a couple of reminders before I invite our panelists to introduce themselves. A couple of reminders that, look, during this evening, we won't be able to accept telephone calls, posting through images or posting through comments, but we will be recording all questions that are submitted via the chat function on this Zoom call. As like last time, we'll be sorting through. We've had some hundreds of questions the last time, so we will be sorting through, making sure that we get through a wide diversity of questions that are a representative sample of the questions that come through on the key topics. Now tonight is a little bit different. We'll be structuring our night around a couple, if we can, questions around route selection and project background as the big key first topic. The second topic will be infrastructure, the size, the height and the span of the proposed infrastructure. So that's clearly a big question that was raised with us on Saturday. Third topic will be around bushfire and risk and safety and health issues, and those are really clear questions that came through on Saturday. Visual amenity, impacts, heritage, and those impacts will be a topic no doubt tonight. Compensation, community benefit process, and of course community engagement and what are the implications of COVID and other such on the project. And to assist, we've got 2 extra panelists joining us here tonight. But before I do introduce them or ask them to introduce themselves, I just re-suggest that when we're asking questions, I'm going to really invite you to write your name. If you can, write your location from where your specific question may be pertinent to, and ask your question in a succinct manner as best you can. As I say, we'll be moderating to make sure that they're fair and they're a representative sample, but they are not being edited. They are not going to be, if you like, sorted through in that sense. But we will certainly be making sure that any questions that do come up will be taken on notice, and we'll be providing a summary of those questions over the coming weeks. So I think that's a really important acknowledgement as well. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists to say hello, and I might just start with Francisco, the project director. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and your role in the project, Francisco.
Hello, my name is Francisco Vizcaino, and I'm the project director for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ashley Clifton. I'm the project development manager for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Hi everyone, my name is Tara Horsnell. I'm the Environment and Planning Lead for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Hi, I'm Dennis McCrone. I'm the Integration Manager for the Western.
Hi everyone, my name's Paul Ower and I'm the Land and Easement Assembly Lead for the Western Vic Transmission Network project.
Thank you, Paul, for joining us. Paul's in the office here with us today, and we've got Dennis calling in remotely as well. So thank you, Dennis, for joining us. Look, thank you all very much for introducing. Again, we'll crack on with the questions. We'll crack on with an update. Before we do, I'd like to invite Francisco to talk us through the key elements of the project, the key lessons we're learning, insights, and I'm going to invite you to talk us through the presentation here.
Okay, I want to start giving a brief background on why we are building this. The reason that this transmission line and a couple of terminal stations are required is that the Victorian electricity network is constrained at the moment. There is no sufficient capacity or sufficient strength in the network to incorporate the additional renewable energy generation that is required to replace the coal-fired power plants that we will be closing very soon in the Latrobe Valley. So I will not go into more detail than that. I think everyone is aware of the challenges that we are facing very soon. So I think it's time to look at more the broader timing of the project. Again, I will be briefer than the previous time. We have two and a half years ahead of us of stakeholder engagement, planning and approvals processes, and the assembly of the land and the easements, after which we will commence construction, ideally mid to late 2022, with the intention of completing the construction of the project by late 2024. Move on, please. Same thing, a bit more detail on the same topic, the activities that we will be undertaking. We will be narrowing down from an area of interest into a corridor and then a route while we progress with the planning and approval processes. And the formal approvals process, which is mostly focused around the environmental effects statement, will run from around a year from now. At that point, a year from now or so, and Tara will elaborate on this topic later on, there will be a formal or official community consultation process as part of that DES. And after that, as I said before, we will be completing that standard process, and we will go into construction hopefully by mid-2022. So touching a little bit on the underground topic, again, I will be brief. There are three main reasons why we are doing overhead and not underground here. The first one is that it's the industry standard in Australia and all over the world. Yes, there are instances of underground lines of this voltage, 220 kV and 500 kV. but those are for different capacities, different characteristics, different features of the line itself, and also of the environments where they are built. So the few instances in the world where, or most of the few instances in the world where a 500 kV transmission line is undergrounded relate to urban environments, urban areas, and typically lines that would not have the capacity that this one has or will have, and also very short sections, so only a few kilometers at any point. Also, the environmental impact of an underground line is much greater than the one from an overhead line, and this is related to the fact that to install a line underground, there needs to be a very intense construction activity, digging a trench, which would be 10 to 15 meters wide, 2 to 3, 4 meters deep. There will be joint pits that need to be built every 500 or 600, 700 meters. Access needs to be guaranteed to all those joint pits. Maintenance is more expensive. There is also a very strong impact in native vegetation, flora, fauna, cultural heritage, aboriginal and historic. The combination of all those basically makes the option of undergrounding a line much more impactful from an environmental point of view. The third reason why overhead is preferred is that it's the economically sustainable option for the Victorian network, because it's undergrounding even a section of the line would result in a multiple times more expensive solution for the Victorian electricity consumers, because this, at the end of the day, this project will be funded by the electricity bills that people are paying. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this is an example of, this is from a project in Germany. It's a 375 kV transmission line that would carry much less capacity than the 500 kV one that we are planning for the section between Sydenham and somewhere north of Ballarat. So this is just an example of the type of environmental or construction footprint that would be caused by undergrounding a line. So this would be something that would look like this for 190 kilometers in Western Victoria. Very difficult to avoid any impact on anything on the ground, like as I said before, fauna, flora, habitat, cultural heritage sensitive areas. With an overhead line, the fact that we can microsite or relocate the towers, we have flexibility to locate the towers. We can avoid this impact because it's only one tower every 400 to 500 meters that we would be installing, and therefore between two towers we have very minimal, if any, ground impact, and therefore the environmental disturbance is much lower. Also, on the topic of the visual impact, which is obviously the big disadvantage for an overhead line, we have a few photos that we put together. I picked these ones from Google Earth. This is, I went to, some people I think in the previous session were saying that we're asking for a reference or an example that goes closer to the area of interest here. Unfortunately, we don't have any examples in that area of the type of towers that we will be building here. So I went to the existing 500 kV. This is around Cressy. You can see that that's the geometry or the shape that the towers in the 500 kV section will have. This is a photo from 300 meter distance from those existing transmission towers. You can see that's how they look at 300 meter distance. Then I took another screenshot at 500 meters and another one at 1 kilometer. So that's how it looks like. These are existing towers. They're in regional Victoria at the moment. And this is how a finished terminal station looks like. This is the Haunted Gully terminal station. It's near Lismore, again in the same area, regional Western Victoria. Now the only comment about this photo is that this is how it looks like before the landscaping is completed. So there is some screening, vegetation screening that will be planted around this terminal station, and that would be the same thing that we would be doing for the extension of the Sydenham terminal station that we will be building, and also for the new terminal station that will be built at some location north of Ballarat. On that topic, that location north of Ballarat needs to be somewhere overlapping the existing Ballarat to Bendigo transmission line that is already there. And that location is to be determined, and we are still negotiating. It's not defined, and we are still negotiating the acquisition of the suitable land for that new facility. Now, the final location of that terminal station will also result in the determination of the route. So if you go to the area of interest map, you see how the area of interest is wider in that area around the Creswick mark. And that's because the site is not selected yet, and therefore we need to have that funnel shape, because we don't really know where the transmission line will end up being. The route and the corridor and everything will depend on what's the on the finally selected or acquired site for the terminal station. And I would suggest we go straight to questions. Chris, please.
Yeah, of course. Look, thank you very much, Francisco, for that. Thank you very much, Francisco, for the introduction. We've already been receiving many questions as they've been coming through, and I think in the interest of time and getting through as much as we can, why don't we fire on with those? We did say the first bundle of questions were going to be about route selection, and Peter Smith has got off to a good start, and he's asking, why are these not being built through already designated areas rather than annoying additional countryside? Now, I'm going to be asking the questions directly as they were submitted to us, so I'm not going to change the wording, and so that's one of Peter's concerns. And basically, his second question is, why aren't they going underground? What are your thoughts on that, Francisco?
Okay, the scope of this project is for an overhead line. On the topic of using existing corridors or existing infrastructure, if we go back to the area of interest slide, if that's possible, Chris.
Yes.
The area between the existing Bolgana terminal station and the existing Wobra terminal station that you can see there, you can see how the area of interest is much narrower in that part of the alignment. And that's because we are building the new transmission line, or the intention is to build the new transmission line in parallel and adjacent to the existing transmission line that is already there. So we need additional easement, so we need a bit more space, because the new lines cannot be there's no sufficient space in the current easement to put another line, but we will be overlapping and using as much of the existing easement as we can. From then on, we would try to, again, stick to the existing one between Wobra and the new terminal station for as long as we can, for the same reason, to try to use existing easements, or to build in the proximity, the vicinity of the existing easement. That's also because of the best practice guidelines for the environmental design of transmission line. Transmission lines strongly recommends that we build in parallel to existing lines and maintaining the stepping, which means that the new towers would be built next to the existing ones. So because it looks like looks better from a visual perspective. Then out of that, we would try to get to that location to be determined in north of Ballarat. From then on, there are no corridors, there are no other transmission lines that go all the way to Sydenham, but yes, there's a highway, there's a freeway. Can we use the freeway? We are looking at that. It's very challenging. It's technically very challenging for a number of reasons. You know, we need to maintain the clearance between the transmission line and traffic and the potential pedestrians, residents, any existing infrastructure, services, features. That part of the, looking at the freeway is something that we are looking at. It's a possibility that we're exploring. It has not been discarded, but it's very challenging. We're looking at it.
You've covered lots there, Francisco. Let's just keep going through this. This route selection and the underground, above ground is still lots of questions coming through. We need to clarify these if I could. In terms of the undergrounding option, could you really give us a bit more details to the cost difference between the underground versus the above ground? Email from Maxine Andrews is, what really is the cost difference between putting cables underground and overhead lines?
In the design needs to done, engineering calculations and things like that would need to be done, but without even looking at the cost of the additional, the land acquisition, which would be different, we are looking at multiples. So probably between 5, 6, and 8 or to 10 times the cost of an overhead solution. Okay, Jim Fassy says he understands that AC underground is not an option, but HVDC, that's what, high voltage direct current, would that be what that means, HVDC? Yes, voltage direct current.
Is completely different. Literature on the line from ABB says otherwise. What studies support this as an option, Francisco?
Well, at the moment, the scope that we have is for an overhead AC line. Yep. And that's, I guess there will be network. Honestly, I cannot answer that question, but I am assuming that when different options were considered before the final solution was decided, I am sure that DC was considered, and DC, from my limited understanding, is only suitable for very, very long distances and when you don't need to connect anything in the middle. In this case, we need that connectivity because there may be some other wind farms that they need to connect. But again, we will take that question offline and we will come back to you.
I'll keep with you if I could, please, Francisco. There's Peter Smith has also asked an ironic question in some ways. If this project is about connecting renewable energies to the network, he asks, how can these steel and concrete structures be an answer for green energy? So he's obviously referring to the embodied energies and the costs of the construction method and the concrete towers. Is there an irony involved in that?
Life of, a triple bottom line life cycle assessment, the embedded energy in the steel and concrete would be more than offset by the additional renewable energy that will be generated during the life of these assets.
Well, that talks to, by email, Maxine Andrews has submitted, Officer Stuart Grimley, the MP, member for Western Victoria, has submitted by email, what is the lifespan of the project? He understands it's about 25 years for each easement. Is that correct? 25 years is the lifespan for the project, or what is the lifespan?
I am not sure about that. I think it's a 40-year term, but again, that's something that we can come back to.
I guess there's lots of questions coming through, and before we move on to the infrastructure itself more specifically, there's a couple. Maxine Andrews has written, what really are the mechanical and technical problems for putting the cables underground? You talked about the impact on certainly the landscape, the cultural, and the botanical, zoological impact. That was a big significant issue. Sorry, we just missed a bit there. Maxine Andrews talks about what are the mechanical, technical problems for putting the cables underground, and you said clearly that there are some cultural impact to cultural sites or botanical sites. What are some of the other mechanical or technical problems that might be?
Mostly during operation, cable has more prone to faults. Again, by like an order of magnitude, any faults on the cable will require the extensive testing, the excavation of the cable to fix it. So the response time for a fault on an underground cable would be much longer. The inspection and maintenance regime for an underground line will also be orders of magnitude bigger. So nowadays, for an overhead line, there will be a visual inspection that will happen every 3 or 4 or 5, 6 years. And that can be done via an aircraft, a drone, or a helicopter or a plane. There's no need to climb structures anymore. Whereas for underground cables, every joint needs to be inspected at least once a year. So that means that the lands, whomever hosted a joint pit, and remember we would have joint pits every 600 to 700 meters, would need to have we would need to build a road, an actual road to access all those joint pits, so those can be inspected at least once a year. And that's an inspection that requires an outage and it takes time. So it's not only the construction, the operation and maintenance of the line is much more onerous to the pockets of the Victorian, or would be more onerous to the pockets of the Victorian electricity consumers.
We may pick up on that cost and maintenance issue as we go through this evening, Francisco. The route is causing many questions to come through, and I think Ash, you talked about the route last on Saturday, and I think Francisco talked about tonight that the route is yet to be determined. And Maxine Andrews has posted a question, and it goes something like this: that there are areas of bush close to our property which are waiting to be included as national park, namely Wombat State Forest. Can you definitely say that the transmission lines or cables will not pass through any of the Wombat State Forest? This clearly is a concern for many of our listeners tonight. Francisco or Ash, could you talk us through the process and what are your commitments you can make at this stage?
Yeah, look, thanks, Chris. Regarding the process for determining the project corridor and then the final transmission route, what we can say is we are investigating the entire area of interest. We are looking to gather information within that entire area, and that includes information around a whole number of aspects, including there's environmental considerations, biodiversity, cultural heritage, but also land use and agriculture, and fire and bushfire risk as well. So we are investigating the entirety of that area of interest and working to narrow that down to the project corridor, and from there narrow it further to the final location of the infrastructure.
It's not necessarily a question that's been posted to date, but could you confirm whether a route has or has not been selected at present, Ashley?
Yeah. At this point, the project is at the very start of the process, and therefore a transmission route has not yet been determined. As I mentioned, the project has developed an area of interest, and we're now focusing on gathering as much information as possible from right across that broad area. And as I said, it's so that we can understand the existing conditions, so that we can narrow down the area of interest to the project corridor.
Yep.
And from there, avoid and minimise impacts to the existing environments and the communities wherever we possibly can. We're continuing to undertake desktop investigations and gather feedback from the community. And this is the information that we're going to be using to narrow down the area of interest to the smaller and narrower project corridor.
Tara, you've been heavily involved in the design of the investigation project around heritage and environmental impact. Could you talk through tonight briefly what that process looks like, what are the steps and stages, and who's doing that sort of work? And then I've got a couple of follow-up questions from our audience tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So we have a team of specialists from Jacobs Consulting that are looking at all of the different environmental aspects across the area of interest. So they're considering ecology, landscape and visual, European heritage, as well as Aboriginal cultural heritage, and then planning. So looking at the planning scheme zones and overlays, and just really understanding the broader area and how it's used, and what those areas are protected for. So, and all of that information will get looked at and then incorporated in our decision making to help us identify a preferred corridor. So there are lots of specialists working on it behind the scenes. Yeah.
So Tara, perhaps to you and to Ashley, before we leave this question behind, can you categorically say that the transition line or cable will not pass through any of the Wombat State Forest?
Yeah, look, thanks, Chris. What we can say is that the area of interest, that's the area that we're assessing and that we're investigating in. and that if the Wombat State Forest is not located within that area of interest, then it's not part of the current investigations that we're working through.
Thank you. Francisco? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that there has been feedback from some members of the community suggesting that we go in order to avoid impacting farmers, residents, that we go through the state forest, not the Wombat State Forest, but I think it's the sorry, I don't remember the name, but yeah, it's been suggested that we go through state forest as opposed to go through private land. That would be a possibility. I doubt that's a possibility, but we would still explore it because it's an alternative that has been proposed by a member of the community, and we will look at it because if it's suggested, it's valid, and we will look at it as well.
I suspect we'll be talking about that many more times in the future, Francisco. Yep. Jessica Roberts from Greendale. We've got a few more questions before we move on to infrastructure, but she asks, your literature says that putting overhead lines would likely be less costly to Victorian households and underground lines would cost multiple more. Can you provide evidence that the detailed cost comparison has been undertaken together with the outcomes of that comparison? So she's looking for the evidence of the comparison between above and undergrounding. Is that something you have done and are able to share?
There was the inception of this project was through a process called a regulatory investment test, and that was done before, and the links are in our website where the different options were considered for this project, and that's basically one of the aspects considered in that process is the economic cost. But we are comparing things like, building a road above ground and building it underground. So it's straightforward that the cost is an order of magnitude different. So it's not a comparable thing. And that's why any 99% of transmission lines in the world are built overhead. It's a different order of magnitude, a completely different order of magnitude.
Francisco, you mentioned there was a report which is on the website. Could you just repeat the name of that report again?
The Project Assessment Conclusions Report.
Project Assessment Conclusions Report. And it's on the project website.
There will be a link in our website, in the project website, to that report and to all the information related to the regulatory investment test for transmission called the RIT. That was the inception of this project.
Thank you. That might go to Jessica's question about the evidence behind it. And so thank you for that, Shiva. And others may look at that place. Also, just before we move into the infrastructure, we've got a couple more questions. Looking for some, maybe a description to the designers. From Jessica again, from Greendale, she says, your literature describes a sensitively designed, located and constructed overhead transmission line. She asks, could you please explain how the project will be sensitively designed and located, given the local landscape and the scale of the 72 metres by 16 metres wide towers? So a broad question, Ashley and others, but I think that refers to also what are the mitigation impacts, how are you screening? You did talk about sensitive screening, and Jessica is saying, well, that's a very large objects. How do we effectively be sensitive about their location?
I think this is mostly, the question is mostly about the visual impact. So there are different things that we can do to mitigate that impact. We can know about the reality is just these are big structures and there is only as much as can be done to conceal them or to use topography to reduce that impact. But there are other things that can be done. Screening, non-reflective coating. What I can ensure is that the design is going to be following the best practice guidelines for environmental impact, including visual impact and visual amenity impact and landscaping impact. Best practice, state of the art as per international institutions. But I will pass on to Tara, because maybe she can provide a bit more color on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. So one of the studies I mentioned earlier was the landscape and visual assessment. So that work is underway, but we'll get into more detail as the project develops and we have more specific design information. But as part of those studies, the specialists will be looking to understand where the key values are. So they look at, obviously dwellings are a really sensitive receptor, and we'll be considering sites. So the sight lines from those dwellings, the houses, to the transmission lines. We also look at heritage sites and, you know, potential impacts to those sites or from those sites to the proposed infrastructure. So there's a number of things that we'll be considering. But yeah, as Francisco said, we will be looking to see if there's topography or some other barrier in the landscape that we can use to sort of shield the towers. In some instances, it might be appropriate to use screening as well. So landscaping will be a consideration for property boundaries, whether immediately adjacent to towers or infrastructure. So there's a number of things that we'll be looking at and yeah, getting into more detail as the design develops.
Thanks, Tara. The questions that were raised on Saturday talked a lot about the proximity of residences and properties to the towers and the line. It hasn't been a question I've seen come up exactly tonight, but I might just foreshadow that and ask from Saturday's questions, what is the likely setback from sensitive properties like residences or farm buildings or other such things? Is there an ultimate setback, or and how does that setback be determined? I might start with you, Francisco, and then maybe Ashley.
By no means would the easement or contain a dwelling in it. So, for example, for the 500 kV line, and this depends on the distance between towers, the easement would be around the 80 to 100 meter size. So under no circumstances there would be a dwelling within that space. That said, we would be aiming to have dwellings as far away from the transmission line as possible. And how can we do that? We can do that by by accessing people's land, talking to landowners, talking to residents, and identifying where those dwellings are. And because that's the only way we can for sure determine whether there's a dwelling there or not. No, we cannot do it via aerial photos or anything like that. We need to go there and we need to be able to obtain that feedback and discuss that with the residents. So that's why we are so keen on coming and interacting with the community to obtain that. And I don't know if maybe Paul wants to talk about what can do and how far we would be ideally, or how far are we trying to be from existing dwellings.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. And look, I think the simple answer to that is as far away as possible. We try to prudently avoid being as close to people's houses, or as far away, should I say, as we can. So in relation to activities within the easement corridors themselves, as you said, the construction of structures within those is restricted. The majority of agricultural activities can still proceed in there, but really it depends on looking at the existing use of the land. And where we've talked about having people, the land agents that are working out in the field at the moment are trying to actively engage with people to understand those activities and to try to mitigate any, I suppose, inconvenience or impact on the land. If we understand what they are, we're working, as you said, up in the Bulgarna to Waubra section at the moment with some landowners that, in relation to, as you've said, abutting and aligning towers and that sort of stuff, if we do parallel up there. And that information that we're gathering is, critical for us to understanding how we can minimise those impacts.
Paul, we may come back to some of the conversations around direct engagement around property in a moment, so please stay with us. Rob and Amanda have asked questions around more specifically about the choice and what the purposes of the alignment are. And Rob's question is, where are the existing lines through this area? Where are the existing overhead lines through this area? rather than south of the Western Freeway. There is an energy corridor in this area. So Rob's question talks to about, I guess, can we be using other assets or easements rather than creating a new one potentially? What are your thoughts on that? I think that's the nature of his question.
Yeah, again, if there's a corridor there, we would use it, but it's most likely it will be a distribution. There will be distribution lines there or dedicated transmission lines to serve wind farms. Is the type of infrastructure that we would find in that area. There is no scale transmission line corridor as such that can be used over there. But again, we are exploring our possibilities, and we would ideally use, if there's something there that can be used, we would try to use it. And this is why, again, that's not the type of thing that we would miss. But again, we are more than happy to listen to the feedback from the community, because if that's something that's there and we can use it and it's preferred by the community, that's the avenue that we would take.
Okay. That responds to Amanda's question in some way when she says, we understand there is an existing easement corridor south of Creswick. Why not put this project next to an existing easement? And when will all the maps be released? So she and others are looking for the detail of the route, and perhaps two-part question. Other easements that have been considered, and when might we know the real maps and locations?
Again, there is a transmission line, existing transmission line, 220 kV single circuit that goes from the existing Ballarat terminal station, which is southeast of Ballarat, and then goes south of Ballarat, the Ballarat urban area, and then all the way west to Wobra, Crowlands terminal station, Ararat, Bolgana, and then keeps going all the way to Horsham. Again, we are using that corridor between Bolgana and Wobra, or trying to use as much of that as we can. Then from Wobra towards somewhere north of Ballarat, we will try, depending on the final location of the terminal station north of Ballarat. But on the other side, on the 500 kV side, there is no clear option. There is no existing transmission line that follows any alignment that even resembles what we would need to build.
Can I ask Tara to think about the next question, or a series of questions that have come through about the route selection, about the process of making the decisions? Kath and Mick have commented, and they said, what layers were used in the desktop analysis to determine the area of interest in the first place? Why weren't communities engaged to determine the area of interest then in the first instance? So,
yeah, thanks, Chris. So there's a few very heavily constrained areas just to the north and to the south of our area of interest. So to the south, there's some infrastructure that we can't cross. And to the north, there's the Ledderderg State Park. So to go around that, to go north of that, would be a significant impact. It would be significant length of line that would be required to go around that park, and as a result, a much more significant impact to the landscape. In terms of community consultation, so we are very early in the process, so we appreciate that people want more information, and we are getting that information across to you as soon as possible. There are some maps online as well, so if you look at the DELP referral website, there's some maps there of the area of interest. In terms of the layers...
Can you say DELP? What is DELP?
Oh, sorry, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. That's a state department. So we submitted a referral to them, which has a series of maps. In terms of the desktop assessments, we've used publicly available data. So there's a data set called the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, which is updated regularly, kept updated by ecologists and managed by the state government. So we've been using that to understand potential for different species to occur throughout the area. We also have the EVC mapping, ecological vegetation class mapping. We have the Victorian Heritage Register sites, Victorian Heritage Inventory sites. We have done a search of the Aboriginal heritage databases. We've also got some mapping of culturally heritage sensitive areas, which basically follow the waterways predominantly, but also We have records of some Aboriginal places that have been recorded throughout the landscape. So there is a lot of data sitting behind this, and our technical specialists that are analysing the data are very familiar with the area. We're also talking to different parts of government as well to validate the work that we're doing and to check that we have correctly identified all of the species and communities that might be present in the area. Similarly, we're talking to different heritage advisors, including heritage advisors at the Ballarat City Council and Heritage Victoria, and we'll continue to have those discussions to make sure that we aren't missing anything in our assessments.
Thanks, Tara. Lots of detail there. So there's information online about the layers. The question is talking about what data sets have been used. Perhaps the question equally, though, was about why haven't the consultation occurred prior to the choice of this solution rather than after the effect of we've chosen the solution of an above ground piece. And there's quite a few questions coming through on that matter, and we'll probably put a line under the above ground, below ground for the moment, but I would ask a couple of these questions. Barbara Burnt has submitted this following question. Ausgrid's statement is all about minimising costs. Who is the decision maker to approve increased costs? Ausgrid does not own the Merrylink interconnect, which operates underground. Who owns and operates this, and why did they manage to have this installed underground? Can someone brief us on that? And who wore the extra costs for undergrounding? Now, Barbara and others are saying we still should be able to have a conversation about the above versus below, and also let's understand what decisions have really been made and how they were made. Francisco.
Ausgrid has the distribution license in New South Wales. So that's a distribution line. That's a much smaller type of transmission line. It's number one. I am not familiar with how that process eventuated, but it's we are talking about a different kettle of fish here. So that's a distribution line. We are talking about a transmission line. Distribution lines are typically undergrounded. Not typically, but are undergrounded very often. Transmission lines, so above 220 kV, about 132 to 20 kV are very rarely undergrounded anywhere in the world.
So part of the answer to that sounds like, Francisco, that the scale of this project as well, the size of the capacity you need to install to connect the solar farms, the wind farms, the new energy generation in the West to the metro grid won't allow for the easy undergrounding. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Okay. Well, Scott Hovey, in the same breath, is saying things such as, are you aware of the work by Southern California Edison
I am.
in the development of undergrounding technology or engineering for 500 kV lines? You say it cannot be done. Is it your opinion?
It's rarely done.
Okay, just wait. You say it cannot be done. Is it your opinion or simply because it was not in the scope of delivery?
Now, yes, it can be done. I've never said it cannot be done. I've said that the standard in 90% of the overhead of the transmission lines of this size are overhead in the world. I'm familiar with that project in California. There are very specific reasons that the Californians must have had to underground that and to spend that amount of money. They may be willing to afford that. The scope of this project is an overhead line. But again, I didn't say that it's never been done or that it's not done or it's impossible. I'm saying that it's not the standard and it's not the typical approach.
Well, I'm going to ask this question from Jane Neville. I'm not sure how you're going to answer it, but the question is pretty straightforward. Why isn't AEMO on this panel to answer the why they decided on these options? AEMO awarded the contract to AusNet and AEMO made the decision. Have you got a...
I cannot answer for AEMO. We are here representing AusNet Services, and as such, we are working on a project which scope is an overhead line.
Jane continues, and it's the last one I'll ask on this. I think we've got lots to get through, but she does ask, can you please comment on AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator? Can you please comment on AEMO retaining the right to cancel this project and refund costs as per the statement in AusNet's 2020 annual report? And under what conditions could this occur? So Jane's been doing research and she knows that there's some stuff that we need to think about. Have you got a view on that?
I can comment on behalf of AEMO. And yes, that's it's a publicly available information. It's in AusNet's annual report, so it's there.
So if someone wants to find out more about that, Francisco, what's the best way for participants tonight to find out more about the pre-project approval phase, the processes by which this option was selected, etc.?
Again, our website, well, people can go directly to the Australian Energy Market Operator website, and there's quite a section on this there. Again, the keyword would be the RITI, the Regulatory Investment Test for Transmission. And the project was called the Western Victoria Renewable Integration Project or something like that, WVRIP. And all the information before contract award will be there.
Okay. All right, thank you. We'll get a wriggle on it. It's getting close to 7 o'clock, but there's been some really good questions coming through tonight, and I really appreciate the 80 so or nearly 90 people who've been participating this evening with lots of really good questions. So hopefully we're acknowledging the questions and we're acknowledging your hard work you're putting into constructing a really tough question. There's been some pretty tough ones tonight, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate Francisco and the team giving it their best shot. A lot of these questions are difficult to answer, but they're making a big effort. Where they can't, they'll be following up with answers online over the coming days. Let's just wriggle forward a little bit. If we could, I want to get through as many as we possibly can. With regard the actual lived experience, Mark Debbie Bayard has asked the question about, once it's constructed, will the towers affect mobile reception or internet or TV signals?
There are very strict standards about electromagnetic interference that this project will need to adhere to. This is a heavily regulated industry, and therefore we don't expect to cause any interference in the mobile reception in the area.
Whilst we're talking about impact, a lot of the construction will be occurring, a lot of the lines will be occurring over viable agricultural land. Can you, there's quite a few questions around in terms of what is possible from what is possible to occur under the lines in terms of agricultural activities, etc. Could you describe, and perhaps also, you know, maybe Paul or others talking about what are the permitted uses on easements under these lines?
Many things. Agricultural activities with certain limits can occur and have occurred in many of our previous projects and existing transmission lines. Farming activities are continued within easements, and we have examples of that, but yeah, maybe Paul can elaborate on this.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. Look, it is an interesting question. I think it's a very valid one. We've got, I think, somewhere around about 1,500 to 2,000 kilometres of existing transmission lines all the way around Victoria, and it's something that we work with every day. There are actually guides on our website, and we have placed a document there about, you know, working around transmission lines, and that does contain sections around the, I suppose, the permitted uses underneath there. You'll see in the section of line that we're talking about that runs out of the Ballarat terminal station up to Bendigo, there's quite an, you know, agricultural activity there existing at the moment. People are still farming under that line there. And, you know, I think the real restriction under there is the erection of buildings, and obviously the storage of flammable and explosive materials for obvious reasons, and obviously the erection of other poles or towers that would come within proximity of the lines themselves. So obviously we don't allow storage of things like yachts with tall masts, and there is a good list of things there, but it does also show that you know, most agricultural activities can continue there.
To the question of the easement management, Paul and Tara, is there any expectation that if an easement is put over a forest, or if your transmission line goes over a forest, does that need to clear the forest or clear native vegetation underneath the lines, and how is that managed?
Yeah, so it will need to be cleared. So an easement is required to provide a safe environment, and the vegetation will need to be maintained to make sure that there isn't any danger of vegetation falling onto the transmission line, or that impinging on the safe clearance that's provided underneath it. So it would need to be maintained. Yep.
So the question earlier about the Wombat State Forest is a important one, in as much as it's not just the line over the top of the forest, it would be an easement, cleared easement underneath the line, correct?
It would be, we recognise the importance of Crown land, state forests, different reserves throughout the area of interest, and we are looking at those areas and trying to avoid impacting on those areas. We recognise they're important to the community and to other stakeholders as well. We're just looking at all of the different environmental values throughout the area of interest and making some decisions on balance, but ultimately we recognise that those areas are really important and we're trying to avoid them as best we can.
They're certainly important to other stakeholders, including natural wildlife, biodiversity, etc. So lots of questions coming through, Tara, on that. So Mix asked, what easement or clearing width is typical for these lines or towers? 100 metres, 50 metres? Do we have a view on that? Paul?
Yeah, look, the width of the easement can vary depending on the span between the towers. I think Ash did cover off on this in our last session, but you know, Francisco mentioned earlier that with the 500 kV, those easements can be standard around 80 up to 100 metres in width. The 220, once again, probably a little bit less, but we're expecting there, if I remember correctly, and I might get Francisco to correct me there, but depending on the spans, they tend to range anywhere from sort of, you know, 50 to 70 metres. But, you know, that does depend on the topography of the land and numerous other factors. So they are things that we do discuss with landowners, obviously, once that alignment is looked at, and the placement of towers, all of those things come into that. So a lot of that does come down to the engagement that we have with people around placement of that infrastructure.
Thanks, Paul. There was a topic raised, yes, on Saturday, and it's starting to come through in the questions about that micro siting of towers. Ashley, could you describe whether the micro siting is it a slight zigzag of the route, or is it actually something really significant, doglegging around important sites or doglegging around important cultural values? Could you describe the extent to which the eventual route can be really nimble and weave its way through important pieces of the countryside?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Chris. I guess the important aspect of micrositing transmission towers is the ability to span over areas that may have constraints or may have values of significance. So by strategically and sensitively siting and locating the transmission towers, there's opportunity to span across other areas which may have constraints or may have other important values that need to be considered. When we locate the transmission line corridor and then start to further microsite these specific tower locations, we are doing that to minimise and avoid constraints where possible. But the real benefit of overhead infrastructure and overhead transmission lines is being able to span across sensitive areas and being able to locate those towers to enable that. Whenever a transmission line does change direction, we are required to build slightly larger towers to enable that. And whilst that change can be accommodated, it is important that we carefully design the transmission lines just so that we do minimise the number of those larger towers. But yes, the transmission line can change direction. There are benefits in keeping the line going in a straight line where possible, but coming back, the real benefit of overhead transmission lines is the ability to span sensitive areas.
Just briefly, Francisco.
Obviously, we need to play with the environmental impact assessment is holistic and needs to look at different aspects. Microsighting and zigzagging the line may have a benefit in the sense of that we may be avoiding ground impact or disturbance of certain punctual features, but in the visual impact side of things, it would look much worse. So a zigzagging line doesn't look as has a greater impact than a nicely built straight line, identical spans line. So we need to play with all those conflicting goals to come up with the best solution from an overall environmental, social, and economic point of view.
Whilst we're talking about footprints and things, could you just quickly describe you showed photos of the terminal station.
Yeah.
What sort of footprint does that need? And have you bought land for that? It's a question from Mick, and he's just keen to sure about what's happening.
We haven't bought any land. And the footprint, if someone helps me, but it's several hectares, a few hectares. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. Look, we are looking to obviously, acquire the land for the terminal station. As Francisco said, we haven't purchased land at this point in time. We are looking at a site there, probably around 50 hectares, I believe. The actual size of the terminal station you saw earlier obviously isn't that large. But what we are looking at is that additional land around there will allow us buffers and screening, and we can obviously make sure that we're reducing those visual impacts by taking that additional land. So that is something obviously that we talked about, that visual impact before. That's one of the ways that we do it, by obviously ensuring we've got those buffers and placing screening around.
Whilst you're there, Paul, you did mention that underneath the lines, you wouldn't be recommending yachts being located there, or there was a height limit. Could you describe what that height limit might be, and will it vary across the length of the route?
Yeah, look, it does. And I think, where you'll see, and once again, I will refer people back to that guide that we have on our internet site, and there is a link to that. We have a guide there to say that vehicles and etc. shouldn't be parked there. There are those restrictions there. When you talk about those heights, we put our minimum, our maximum height requirements. But we are happy to work with landowners, and there is a process by which we can assess other activities and make sure it's about safety. And that's really what we're trying to make sure there, that we keep people safe and that activities aren't occurring under there that obviously can impact them or the transmission lines. So where you talk about those heights, obviously as you come off a tower, the line's a lot higher. So we can look at some of those things, and especially in relation to pathways and gates and that sort of thing. So yes, there is some flexibility there, and they're the sort of things we're looking to engage with landowners about.
Paul, stay with me. Anonymous post, but one that's important about future-proofing is that if this path is accepted, whatever the route is, whatever the final dog legs look like, and the overhead transmission lines are erected, will any future project propose to erect more additional lines and follow the same path adjacent to this line? So to what extent is this the ultimate completed project, or is this just a start of an easement where more infrastructure will be built over time?
We cannot read the future, but what we can do is look at the integrated systems plan for the national electricity market. That's the electricity network in the east coast of Australia. That's South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, and Queensland. And this is a project that's part of a bigger picture of a long-term process that will take decades to expand the electricity network. I would say it's highly unlikely that any additional expansion to these transmission lines is going to be built in the lifespan of the people in this room.
So in short, Francisco is saying it's not part of the scope, but you can't rule it out.
But again, this is part of a long-term plan, strategic plan that shows, it's the ISP, the Integrated Systems Plan, and that shows all the future planned projects for the next couple decades, I think. And there is nothing additional to this that I can think of, but it can be checked there. It's available. It's publicly available information.
All right. So just let's check in. It's now 7:10 thereabouts. We've done, just for those who've just joined us, welcome. For those who have stayed with us, thank you for that. Hopefully we're getting through lots more questions tonight, and you can see that we're taking this very seriously. My name's Chris Robinson. I'm the independent moderator here, and I'm doing my best to get through as much as we can. We've got an additional panelist tonight, Dennis McCrowan. Dennis has got a specialist interest in bushfire risks and other areas. So welcome, Dennis, to our panel. There's quite a few questions coming through. So for those who think we've got to put our ears in so we can hear Dennis, because he's not in this room, so the rest of the panelists will put our headsets on. And I welcome you, Dennis. There's quite a few questions here.
Hi, Chris.
A lot about not only about bushfire, but health personally for those who are near. So I'm going to post a few questions to you to start with. This is from Peter Smith, and his concern is that Greendale is an extreme fire-rated risk area, and why would you increase the risk by installing overhanging power lines? This is a bit of a start, Dennis. Over to you.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, look, that's a reasonable question to ask. Yes, it is a fire risk area, but pretty much the whole of Victoria is a fire risk area. And unfortunately, the mode for transport of electricity is overhead and underground, and both have complexities and can cause fires. But from a transmission perspective, we haven't caused a bushfire in Victoria to date, and that was investigated by the Royal Commission as well in 2009. To cover that off as well, we have state-of-the-art protection systems that within a millisecond milliseconds can turn the power off. So from a perspective of fire risk, it's a fairly safe, healthy network that we build. Sorry, Chris, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Oliver Hinton from Greendale. I'll just continue on this fire hazard area. He states that the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission proposed that Victorian planning provisions related to bushfire and the CFI guidelines for assessing permit applications in areas of high bushfire risk be amended in order to give priority to protecting human life and to ensure that development does not occur in areas which either bushfire risk or environmental cost of making people safe is too high. And his question is, doesn't an overhead cable cutting across all roads out of the state forest create a serious fire risk for local communities?
Well, the cable going over the top of the road doesn't necessarily create the fire risk. I think most of that was referring to people living in bushfire risk areas and the ability to evacuate should a fire occur. And that's what the Royal Commission centred on, was the speed at which a fire can move and the amount of time or notice that people receive, and how fast and how available their exit from that area might be. And that's what the restrictions apply to. the power lines going over the top of a road don't necessarily create the fire itself. It's more about a raging bushfire in our environment.
Lee tells us or asks us a simple question: will these towers fall over in windy conditions?
These towers would be state-of-the-art constructed, extremely strong towers, and they'll be built for 100-year plus weather events. So we don't expect them to fall over at all, no. Sorry, Chris, I can't hear you now.
Right.
Right.
Peter asks, will AusNet guarantee in writing that any liability would be covered for any fire started as what happened in the Kinglake fires?
So the transmission network is an extremely heavily regulated network. Our license to operate effectively covers the way we operate our network across the state. In terms of signing statements of liability, I think we'd be the same as any government institution or corporate, be held to account on our actions.
No doubt that is the case, Dennis, but there's a lot of inquiries and concerns about the old standards may not be actually suitable for the new world of advanced climate change, extreme weather events, etc. Barbara Burnt is, you know, she makes very clearly the point. Our weather is becoming more unpredictable with climate change, and there were transmission lines that fell only in 2020 during intense storms. And that's a concern that's raised by quite a few online. And so my question, perhaps Dennis, through Barbara, is to sort of say, how have we built in not just to current standard best practice, but also potential future changes to the way our weather events occur and firestorms, etc.
Yeah, okay. So I can't talk to the specifics of the incident that occurred earlier on in 2020, but other than the fact it was an extreme event and something that this state hadn't seen in hundreds of years. So, and that's what affected the tower lines there. However, we are undertaking full investigations on that, and any findings from that will be fed into designs not only in Victoria but across Australia in terms of how do we mitigate it against a 200-300 year weather event.
I'm going to push on with the health piece here, Dennis. There's quite a few questions about personal health as well. About this was Emma from Balan wrote this during the last couple of days, and she said, "How safe is it to live near the lines and the towers?" And she's concerned that the studies have shown an increase in incidence of leukemia. Can you share some thoughts or dispel any rumours about that, Dennis?
Not able to talk fully towards that. I mean, I'm not an expert in electromagnetic fields. There is governing body called the PANSA that looks after the regulation on electromagnetic fields, and we comply with the PANSA regulations. In terms of studies regarding leukemia, to my knowledge, that has not been linked to the levels of EMF coming from transmission lines. There is studies to show what the safe level of EMF is, and because we have a regulated system where we control how close people are allowed to live to a transmission line. We know that, for instance, people operating standard equipment in their house, like computers and electric blankets and so forth, will be exposed to more EMF than they will be standing at the front of their house or in their property close to a transmission line. So I can't really talk to the whole leukemia scenario though.
Thanks, Dennis. Francisco, is there anything on the website there people can go to and understand some of the more, if you like, the learned peer studies around EMF issues and impacts, understanding the health impacts of the project, of such examples?
Yeah, I believe we have some links to some fact sheets about living in the vicinity of transmission lines in the website that can be accessed there. But again, I want to reiterate Dennis's point that we are the distance that by regulation, by law, by standards we need to maintain from any dwelling in the vicinity of the transmission line means that the exposure to EMF would be by living even in the closest possible distance to a transmission line would be much lower than the exposure that you get from being around a microwave oven and an electric blanket and any type of regular day-to-day equipment.
So just if you could clarify for us, just how close is the...
Just clarify for us, how just close is the minimum distance from the easement for a dwelling?
So in an unlikely situation where a dwelling was on the boundary of the easement, which is something that we are not going to build for at all, we would be 50 in a straight line at the closest possible. I would need to do the numbers, so it would be 35 to 40 meters in a horizontal distance, but then the lowest point of the conductor would be at around 15 to 17 meters high. So it's, you do the old triangle thing and you can get the distance there.
Yeah.
So in that sense, is it
a site-by-site consideration about how close to the easement, or is it, yeah, okay.
It would be about the distance to the conductor. So the conductor between towers is much higher when it's linked to the tower. It's a catenary curve.
Yeah.
So the lowest point, the sag, will be around the 15 to 17, 18 meters high.
Yeah, and probably worth saying
for the 500 kV. I think Dennis.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Just worth iterating.
We've got lots. I'm just while Dennis is still with us. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to answer that. We do have tower lines that housing development has built up to those tower lines. And you'll find a lot of that situation occurring in the metropolitan area. And houses are situated, 30, 40 metres from those tower lines. And there was rigorous studies, not done by us because it was developers building up to those tower lines.
Yep.
But they had to provide studies on EMF and so forth to the state departments to prove the health of that situation. But there's a
Dennis,
lot of...
Yep.
I think there is a lot of houses built very close to power lines.
Thanks, Dennis. There's also quite a few comments coming through, Dennis, about the fire. Now, we've obviously just passed a really horrendous fire season in Southeast Australia and across the country.
Yes.
There's a lot of anxiety, naturally, about causes of fire and how to mitigate fire. And we only saw very, very, very successfully the aerial bombing, aerial fire bombing was a great tool during many fires we saw during the summer. Jim, Fassi and others, many questions are coming through asking you, Jim, and asking you, Dennis, and others. Can you comment on the guidelines for aerial fire bombing near overhead HV lines? And Jim is concerned that he's been told that water bombers will not operate where the overhead lines are in the vicinity. Can you share some light on that, Dennis?
Yeah, so they do operate water bombing on power lines, and the fires you talked about, which occurred in the East Gippsland, was in our distribution network this year. And there was numerous occasions where the CFA firebombed power lines and infrastructure around those power lines. They do that in conjunction with talking to us. We don't always get notified that that's the case, but there's a couple of things. Main one, they try to notify us when that occurs, and we take precautionary measures for isolating the supply onto that particular power line. But we do go in the event, and we have protection systems that operate in the event of them water bombing our power lines, so forth. So the biggest damage we get from that is we have to go and clean all the insulators before we can turn it back on, because they have a retardant in the water that we have to clean off the insulators.
So in short, Dennis, if I'm reading you, hearing you correctly, if there's a grass fire on an easement after this construction, there'd be no policy reason why a fire bomber could not immediately deploy to assist if it's safe to do so. Is that right?
Yeah, so if there's a fire, if there's grass fire, for instance, wouldn't normally be calling a fire bomber out. It's most likely the high intensity extreme bushfires that you get, where they deploy very expensive aircraft to firebomb. We have people situated in, when we have a bushfire situation, we'll have one of our liaison officers situated in Emergency Management Victoria's headquarters, and they deal directly with the CFA chief and the police and coordinate the efforts. And they're in direct contact with our control centre as well. So should they choose that they want to firebomb an area, and they might choose to do that because we have an easement, and that easement is a really great fire break. And so they have done in the past where they will firebomb the area leading up to an easement in order to slow the spread of the fire. They'll contact us and we'll shut the power off. That's just by flicking a switch in the control room. So that's the best way, because then that's controlled and managed by us. But like I said, we haven't always been notified, but the protection systems will operate and so forth as well.
Just while we're talking about bushfire, at least extreme, but it's critically important, Kath and Mick have placed, will the placement of the transmission line or towers impact where fuel reduction burns can be planned? And ultimately, does this limit the capacity for fuel reduction in already bushfire prone zones?
That depends on the intensity of the fuel reduction burns. Yeah, so we would be concerned with people burning off in large sizes due to the smoke, because the smoke will trip our protection systems. And so that would be a concern for us. It won't do any harm to them, but it'll be tripping off our lines, so forth. So we would be concerned with that. And we certainly don't want to see a bushfire get away on us.
Yeah. Look, we've got a couple more questions before we move on to some visual impact and compensation. I know there's a lot of queries about compensation, but before we do, Dennis, don't leave us. There's lots of really interesting things about, perhaps we don't know the exact, you've mentioned you don't know the exact science behind it, but have you, Melissa Thompson and others are saying, they've heard that EMF does affect reproductions in animals. Can you talk about the EMF impacts on reproduction of livestock or other such things?
I'll be honest, I can't talk to that, other than the fact, what I do know from studies that have been done by the industry is that it's found that tower lines, when living in close proximity to tower lines, is not detrimental, as long as you're not up there beside the power line for a constant time, and moving in and out and under power lines does not cause any problem at all. But I haven't heard that one about reproductive issues with cattle. But like I said, so if you were to jump onto Google Earth, you'll see transmission lines running through parts of the suburbia Melbourne, and housing estates built right up to it, and that's been the case for, I don't know, 50, 60 years. Sorry, Chris, I can't hear you now.
Thank you. Is it good? Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I'm conscious that we've talked about towers, we talked about the routes, we talked about what it might look like. There was lots of questions on Saturday to Ashley and Francisco about, well, what's a real example of what you were proposing in terms of a route in nearby locations that people could visit, about the heights, the dimensions, the type of construction, just so we've got a really good physical something to look at. I'm looking at you, Ash, because I think you've mentioned a number of sites on Saturday that people could visit and say, this is pretty much in terms of the design and construction. Where would you recommend people to go and get a start to feel?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, as I mentioned on Saturday, the existing transmission network, there's a 500 kV transmission line running from Moorabool Terminal Station near Geelong towards Haywood through southwest and western Victoria. If people were wanting to have a look at an indication of what the transmission infrastructure would look like, if they were to drive along the Hamilton Highway from Geelong, they would have multiple opportunities to view the infrastructure, and in fact will drive underneath it on multiple occasions as well. Specifically as you get closer to from say Inverleigh down to Cressy, and then from Cressy right through Lismore to Derrinallum to Mortlake, there's a number of situations where you will get a really good view of an existing 500 kV transmission line, and that's a really good representation and indication of what this infrastructure that's proposed for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project will look like.
Ash, is there an example of a substation or a ground infrastructure that will be comparable with what might be planned for this project?
If you're heading out on the Hamilton Highway, as Francisco mentioned earlier, and we showed some photos of the Haunted Gully terminal station, that is located out near the regional town of Lismore. And there may be some opportunities depending on access to local roads to have a look at that newly constructed terminal station. And that will provide a good indication of what the terminal station infrastructure will look like.
Right, thank you. Now we've got quite a few coming in. It's now +7. For those who've just joined us, thank you and welcome for joining us. We've still got 60 or so people listening in, and so thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. For those who've just joined us, we appreciate your time with us. We've got our panellists today, Tara, Dennis, Paul, Ashley, and the project director, Francisco, have been answering lots of questions about everything from construction to location. They've been really tough questions, and I think they've been really very useful. And hopefully I've done my part in getting your points across as well. There's a lot on visual impact, Tara, and I know you introduced the topic of the assessments and how you're going to go about this process. There's a real concern. Olivia's one, for example, she's posted that really these towers will change the rural character of my area, and I'll be looking onto these towers. This will devalue my property and will affect my amenity. How will you ensure that I am not adversely affected by the project? Perhaps I'll start with you, firstly, Tara, about the impacts you're considering, and maybe secondly, Paul, to talk about what considerations from a financial perspective are being considered from the project. So firstly to you, Tara.
Unmute myself, sorry about that. So yeah, we recognise that the towers are quite large and could change the setting. So we're very aware of that, and we are trying to look at ways to position the infrastructure and the towers in areas that are less sensitive, and to minimise the impacts to houses by just maintaining distance, using topography to shield as much as possible. But we recognise that there will be some unavoidable impacts. So in those situations, we will be looking to see how we can reduce those impacts. And it might be some screening opportunities at the property boundary to sort of shield the or screen that infrastructure from the property.
Before we go, so
Yep.
Olivia's house, her property is looking straight onto a major bit of infrastructure. You're proposing that on her property boundary potentially, there's screening which may grow to a certain height at a certain time where there's a visual barrier. Is that the, sort of one of the suggestions that could be considered?
Yeah, look, it'll be considered in certain circumstances. Obviously, the towers are quite tall, so you can't screen all of the entire line, but there could be some circumstances where it will be effective. But yeah, it's something that we need to look at as we progress through design, but it's definitely one of our key assessments.
So talking about Scott Hovey has posed this question about please explain in more detail what you really take into account from a visual perspective.
Yeah, so we look at landscapes that are recognised in the planning scheme. We look at, views from national parks. We look at views from heritage places. And we also look at things like the tourist routes through different areas, and really try to position the infrastructure in an area that isn't known to be really significant, and to try and position the infrastructure away from dwellings to maintain a distance, to make it less dominant in the landscape. And also, as Francisco mentioned earlier, for the Bulgana to Waubra section, there is an opportunity to position the new infrastructure in step with the existing transmission line through that area. So we're looking to do different things in different areas the best we can, but we do recognise that they're large towers, and it can change the landscape of an area.
Or second part of Olivia's question.
The second part of the question, Paul, was about loss of amenity, but also loss of property value. Can you share your insights as to whether this project will reduce property values? Under what circumstances are you looking at things such as compensation? And what's the financial story to residents and landowners with regard to these projects, Paul?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose there's a couple of points to make there. And I think the first one is that the payment of compensation to landowners is actually for those that host the transmission line. So where we actually take an interest in the land in the form of an easement, and that is calculated out in accordance with the Land Acquisition Compensation Act. So under the provision there, basically what it's saying is that compensation to landowners should make sure that they're no worse off financially. It allows for a number of considerations, the existing use of the property, whether it's farming land, whether it's rural lifestyle, what purpose the land's currently put to. That is calculated out. As I said, there's provisions and guidelines around that. It is an independent valuer that does that assessment. And they, as I said, they take into consideration a range of considerations. I think from obviously the current market value, if there's an expected depreciation of the market value, there's compensation around that. Disturbance to the use of the land for farming purposes is one we've sort of touched on a bit earlier. Special value, we've talked about obviously some of those family farms that have been in there for generations. It's hard to put a monetary value to that, but you have to try. So we look at those sort of things and try to work out a suitable financial compensation to landowners.
So that's landowners. Well, what about those near neighbours who may not be hosting a tower or not have an easement across their property, but those who are directly impacted by the visual impacts? How do they get either considered in this process?
Apologies for not unmuting. Look, Chris, the compensation that is paid to landowners is directly related to the acquisition of the easement. There's, I suppose that's where the compensation's based. We do try to obviously mitigate the impacts all the way through, and I think that's where we're looking at the location of the infrastructure currently. We've talked about obviously trying to work around the reduction of visual impact. There will be impact. I think on there, as Tara said, we've got towers that it won't be able to be fully mitigated, but that's how we try to work around that to reduce the impacts we're having through those areas.
Francisco, firstly, thank you, Paul. But Francisco, there was mention earlier this evening about a community benefit fund, and it was certainly something we talked about on Saturday. Are you in a position to talk through what in fact is a community benefit fund? For what purpose does it exist, and what stage are you at with its development?
Given that we are aware of the impact that this project is going to have on the community, and that some people will have their visual amenity impacted, as Paul was describing before, but will not be directly compensated, we want to the intention is to give something back to the community, and with that intention, there is a multi-million-dollar community fund set up that will be distributed according to the requirements, inputs, feedback, contributions from the community. So we will be setting up a process by which we will be obtaining that feedback, suggestions, proposals from the community to determine what's the best use of that money that we want to revert back to the community as part of the project.
Francisco, how far away are we from seeing the workings of that? What the amount might be? How much are you talking about? Have you got any views on that?
It's several $1 million, and the process will start in the next couple of months, if not, in the next couple of months probably. We will be setting up the groups that will serve as a forum to receive any proposals, suggestions, feedbacks about what's the best use of that fund.
So just to be clear, it's a community benefit fund, several $1 million, is that right? And the community will be directly involved in the prioritisation of funds and through councils, through the local councils?
Not necessarily through councils. Councils will have a voice, but they will be only one of the voices. So members of the community will be able to contribute and participate on those decisions as well.
So
these are all important considerations around the visual impact and also the impact on the wider community.
These are all important considerations on the impact of the wider community as well. And some of the I think you mentioned earlier, Oliver Hinton has called a reference to your previous comment tonight that 300 plus jobs might be created across the project, whether that was tonight or I'm not exactly sure. But since he goes on to say, since Australia, the net importer of steel and pylons, how many more jobs would be created in the region if the cable were buried? Jobs for local contractors. So I think there's a couple of things there I'd like you to perhaps describe to us. What are you estimating as the economic impact from the project as you currently understand it, and whether a net assessment considers in the earliest days undergrounding would be a net different economic story for the locals and jobs and industry in Victoria and Australia.
So if we stick to the procurement of materials, the steel and the conductor for an overhead line would most likely be imported, but the cable would also be imported as well. So I don't think that would make a lot of difference in terms of economic impact in local or national economic impact, because the sourcing of those will be most likely from overseas, because there is no manufacturing of that, not competitive commercial manufacturing of those materials in Australia anymore.
Francisco, would this project be subject to the Victorian Industry Participation Plan?
It's not at the moment.
It's not.
It's not.
What that plan would do to describe and define the extent to which local producers and manufacturers and labour hire companies are required to participate in the project. Is that something you'd look into a specified plan about using local suppliers and labour?
It's not part of the scope, but for obvious reasons, the contractors that end up undertaking the construction of the project will resort to local resources for many of the trades and the supplies of certain materials, if that's more competitive and in commercially available.
Clearly, we're not at that stage of the project.
We're 2 or 3 years away from that.
2 years away, but clearly there's interest from our community that if this is going to be such a big project, we need participation in the project as well, jobs and income for locals. And I think that's something to look out for. So Jim Fassy and others are just wrapping this one up. They're concerned that the well, the question's around if your offer for compensation for property value loss is to the landowner who hosts the tower or has the line across, what options are there for the rest of us neighbours whose property is devalued? Is class action our only option? And I think, Paul, you talked a little bit about the near neighbour impact. You talked, Francisco, about the Community Benefit Fund. Is there anything else you can give to Jim and others about, well, if in fact there is a net loss economically to them, do they only have legal provisions available to them?
Well, I would say we don't have a route. We don't even know where the line is going to be. So maybe it's a bit too early to be. I understand the concern, but it may be the case that we end up finding a route that minimizes the visual impact to such a level that, you know, and that would be a fortunate solution and the preferred outcome, that hopefully we don't need to have these conversations. And that would be the intention, and that's what we will endeavor to achieve, a final route that minimizes the impact, including the visual impact, of course. And because we are absolutely aware of the impact that this can have on those landowners that will have that impact in the value of the properties without having any direct benefit from it or compensation.
Okay.
I'm conscious of time. There's a couple more before we start wrapping up tonight, but there's a couple of important.
Before we start wrapping up for this evening, there's a couple of really important health-related questions, Francisco and Dennis, if you're still with us. Kath and Mick and others are really highlighting the fact that regional communities have been faced with bushfires, drought, and currently the impacts on COVID. Has there been any consideration to the impacts of this large-scale project, let's say over 5 years, that will have on the mental health of regional communities? So there's a couple of pieces there. One is the longer-term strategic health impacts of such a big project, and there's also the matter that was raised when we first talked about the current level of distress or anxiety about this project. So firstly, I'm going to ask you, Francisco, to talk about what sort of general consideration has there been about the impact of this on mental health, such a large project from a regional perspective, and secondly, what are those immediate steps that those people who are affected directly by the project who are feeling distress or anxiety, what are their next steps and how can you assist?
On the first question, it's probably a similar answer as the previous one. We are going to try to minimize that impact as much as we can to reduce that disturbance or any affecting people's mental health. On the second question, people who feel strong levels of distress about the project, they should contact us, and we will provide avenues for them to get support. But again, we need to know who you are so we can help you. So please reach out to us, and there are several channels to contact us through our website.
Okay, so clearly those who are struggling, distressed, even more so with the announcements today about lockdown, further concerns, it may be hard for people to reach out, but you're hoping that they can make a phone call, an email, contact through the website. That's the best way at this stage, so that you can direct them to a service or a method by which they can get the immediate support that they need to help you, help them understand the situation. Okay, thank you. In terms of community feedback, just a couple of really important ones here, which I opened this evening's meeting with an acknowledgement of country. And perhaps to you, Tara, Scott's posed the question broadly, but also specifically, can you advise from who from the Wadawurrung community has signed off or been consulted in the project to date? He's saying that in discussions with local elders he's had, they're not aware of the project. Yet in the meeting with Francisco, clearly stated that there's been some discussions cleared with via local Indigenous groups. I mean, could you just talk through who have been consulted, how have they been consulted, what's happening next, and Francisco, if you could back in that with what you know so far. So Tara, perhaps to you.
Yeah, thank you. So we offered a project briefing to each of the registered Aboriginal parties in our area of interest. And we met with each of the registered Aboriginal parties, and it was up to them to elect who they wanted to be part of those meetings. But we met with Dja Dja Wurrung, Eastern Ma, Barinji, Gudin, sorry if I'm pronouncing names wrong, Wurundjeri, and Wathaurong. So we have met with each of those registered Aboriginal parties. That was ahead of the formal process. So we have just issued notice of intents as well. So we've just sent out a letter to Dja Dja Wurrung, Eastern Ma and Barinji Gudin, as well as Aboriginal Victoria. So we will be having inception meetings to start that process formally and get into the cultural heritage management plan process. But we are doing cultural heritage management plans across our whole area of interest, and we'll continue to talk to the registered Aboriginal parties. I don't have the specific name of the people that were at those meetings, but we have definitely engaged with each of those registered Aboriginal parties.
Tara, and Francisco, there's an anonymous comment about, can you provide the community with details of all the Aboriginal elders who have indicated that they will not support underground options? I think it's referring to a comment you made earlier this evening.
Yeah, this is not something that we have in writing. This was verbal feedback that we had in our initial discussions. This is quite evident that they don't want a trench dug, 100-kilometer long trench dug in the land that they are the custodians of.
Francisco, clearly Tara's talked to a process of engagement with the registered Aboriginal groups, and that will clearly be one of the major topics of conversation, I suspect, over the coming months and years, as to if it is going to be, what are the impacts, how to mitigate those impacts. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So at our initial project briefing, we just introduced ourselves and the project, but we didn't have a lot of detail to share at that point. Now for the Bulgana to Barbara section, as I said, we've started the cultural heritage management plan process. And through that process, we'll start with desktop assessments after the inception meeting. And then we'll do some field work across those areas to understand the significance of the Aboriginal cultural heritage through that area. So it is the start of the process. It will take some time to collect the information we need to fully understand those impacts.
Let me say that with WAC on this member of the community who was concerned about the Wathaurong registered Aboriginal party, the WAC as they call themselves. We've worked extensively with Wathaurong on the Stockyard Hill project, a 76-kilometer long transmission line. We work extensively with them on that project, and we have a very good relationship.
As there's a couple of comments from Peter Smith and others concerned that about the panel, whether the panel has spent enough time on the ground, visiting the sites, visiting the national parks, visiting areas, to provide them confidence that you know the area, and equally that the local member, Catherine King for Ballarat, member for Ballarat, has written to Angus Taylor to raise concerns about the lack of consultation with the community. And could you share lights on that? Firstly, how have you been visiting the site during COVID? What is the process of visiting sites, knowing the direct locations? And in fact, there's a response to the local member who's in favour of the undergrounding model, like according to this submitter from Peter Smith. Any reflections on that about firstly knowledge of the site, and secondly addressing local MPs' concerns?
So first of all, we are at the beginning of the process. Let's all remember that we are at the beginning of the community engagement, and we are at the beginning of the investigation of the area of investigation now, or area of interest. We've visited all of the 6 potential hosting councils at least twice. I believe each one of us in this room have gone through those meetings. Every time we've driven up to there, to Stall or Ararat, to Dalesford, Balan, we've stopped and we've tried to drive around to know a bit better the area that we are talking about. Obviously, we cannot access private land because we didn't have the license to do so. Now, with the licenses that we have already obtained, we are visiting the sites when also the potential sites for the new terminal station. We go there, we have a look, we get a feeling, we get a sense, but we're at the beginning. There will be a lot of investigation in the areas. We will be going there, we will know the places, but we've done as much as we can to date. In terms of the community engagement and comments from the member of the parliament, again, we are at the beginning of the process. We are desperate to obtain as much feedback as we can. We are getting a lot of information through the website, through these sessions, the questions, we understand the concerns. We want to get to people's land because we want to know exactly what's in their land, what their interests are, what their concerns, what their requests could be in case of potentially hosting the line. How could we accommodate their specific needs for their farming purposes, for visual amenity, for whatever. That's why we need all that feedback, and that's why we are here, and that's why we have so many channels for the community to communicate with us.
Thanks, Francisco. Ash, you've talked about the consultation program, the letters being sent to interested areas. Could you talk through that briefly, and also just provide our audience tonight confidence that those engagement techniques are not just about online, because there's clearly people who do not have email and do not have internet. How are we making sure that everyone can participate in this project, not by just dropping a pin on the plan? And can you talk us through the letter communication process to date, Ash, and what do we expect in the future?
Yeah, not a problem, Chris. And look, firstly, just want to obviously mention that we are making sure that our engagement does comply with all the social distancing requirements and any other guidance from both the state and the Commonwealth governments. As Francisco mentioned, we have been on site a number of times. I myself have been out and met with a few landowners to understand the situation and specific circumstances. In terms of the engagement and the communication with landowners, we have sent letters to landowners in areas where we would like to undertake further investigation and get further information. We have been progressively sending out these letters to landowners, and we started with the western part of the project, so the area from Bulgana. And from then, we have continued to work our way in an easterly direction towards Melbourne. Now, given the area of interest, it is much larger for the 500 kV section of the project, and the 500 kV section is from the new terminal station to be located somewhere north of Ballarat, up into the Sydenham terminal station, which is on the northwestern side of metropolitan Melbourne. Given the significant difference in size of that area, we are progressively working to investigate this particular part of the project area and have sent letters to the landowners again in areas where we would like to get further information and understand the area to a greater extent. We're continuing to gather this information across the broad area of interest, and we're continuing to send letters to landowners in areas where we need to collect further information and get a better understanding of these areas.
And
could you just describe confidence that we would have in its combination of letters? You'd be in a post-COVID world, it would have been you knocking on doors, I guess, visiting, holding town hall meetings, having all sorts of farm gate discussions. But in this current world we're in, the letters, the postcards, and the mail outs are probably just as important to make sure those who don't have internet can get access. Melissa Thompson and others are concerned that some of the older or less connected people still need to be involved in this project. Can you give them confidence that those people will be involved in the project information gathering at this stage?
Yeah, definitely, Chris. We genuinely are working to ensure that we have engagement opportunities that do suit everyone within the area of interest and across the communities. As you mentioned, we have sent out postcards to everyone within the area of interest. It was just around 60,000 or something. So we've sent those out to everyone within that area of interest, and we are looking to ensure that we have multiple avenues for people to engage and communicate with the project. we're looking at posters to be placed in specific areas throughout the community, again, to provide information and awareness about the project, and also provide people with the relevant communication methods, such as the project email, the phone, project farm hotline phone number, and the website, so that people have an opportunity to make contact. And if people would like to have further communications, members of the project team, we're more than happy to have follow-up phone conversations, and where applicable and where in line with relevant restrictions and social distancing requirements, we are more than happy to come out and have face-to-face conversations.
Time has beaten us tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We've got through, I think, a good load of questions. Thank you all for sticking with us tonight. There's been questions around everything from bushfire. We've had route selection. We've had questions around infrastructure, the type, the design, the setup, that sort of piece. We've had really interesting questions around health. We've had interesting insights around the decision-making process, visual impact and compensation related questions, questions around community benefit, compensation, and ways to engage. I think it's been a really robust series of questions coming through. For those who didn't get their question read, we really apologise for that. We've had many, many hundreds coming through. We've tried to select a range of representative sample of questions, so thank you for those. Please remember that all questions will be recorded. They have been recorded. They will be consolidated and they will be answered in complete form over the coming weeks as we gather more information. The project team has been pretty clear that this is the early start of the project. It's been my pleasure to be part of this early stage of the project. Before we do hand you over to the rest of your evening, I'd like to thank Tara Horsnell, who's Environmental Planning Manager, Dennis McCrone, who's been helping us with bushfire and risk-related issues tonight. Thank you, Dennis. We've had Ashley Clifton, who's been helping us with design and engineering-related planning issues. Paul Uwe, who's been helping us as best he can with property, easement, land, and compensation-related challenges. I think we might see more of you, Paul, over the coming weeks and months, because they're going to be clear questions. So thank you all, and of course, Francisco. Francisco, the project director, has been with us all the day. So you've been working very hard on this project. It's not giving up, and it's harder and harder as these COVID restrictions apply. But I know the team's dedicated to making sure this project is a great success. So it's been really tremendous having you here, and we wish your team every success. Just in terms of, I'll share the final screen for tonight, and that is the next steps, or at least the emails. Let me know if you can see all that. So thank you for attending tonight. The next one will be on 9th of July, which is Thursday this week, Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. And of course, you can contact the team at any stage on info@westvicnp.com.au. And that's where you get most information for the project. I want to thank you all very much for your contributions. I thank you all for your time this evening. I wish you a very safe and happy evening, and please be careful. Want to find out more about the COVID descriptions and the requirements, dhhs.com, .vic.gov.au is a great place to go to find out how it might impact you and your family over the coming 6 weeks. Thank you all very much. Wish you well. Good night.